So, um, it's about 11:53 at night where I live, and I kind of just got up. So, yeah. Anyways, hey everyone, it's Nick from Universally Idiotic. It's been a while, um, and it's almost a little bit too late on what I wanted to do with this. So today's Veterans Day. Well, technically, yesterday was. The interesting thing for me, though, is well, one, I'm an idiot who thought Veterans Day was yesterday because why else would we have that Friday off? It just didn't make any sense. But the other thing is that in the rest of Europe, and actually when Veterans Day initially started, it was called Armistice Day. And that's kind of important. Yes, honoring the troops is more so, but it's nice to know the origin of these kind of things. Because 99 years ago today, the Allied forces and Germany signed a armistice saying there'll be no more fighting. I can't remember exactly how long that was supposed to last, but instead it became the official end of World War One. Germany was the last nation to sign an armistice, and ultimately it never re-engaged in the conflict. It actually had a revolution, which is kind of what formed the Weimar Republic and led to Hitler, but that's a different story. The thing is, World War One was the first modern war that was a global conflict. Um, 20 million people died. Now it's not as much as how many died in World War Two, but um, it happened only 20 years earlier. Now, for me as a history major, I find World War One really interesting. It actually pisses people off when I say I'm more interested in World War One than World War Two, but it's true. Um, World War One was a lot more of a gray area, and that's the thing about Armistice Day is it initially just commemorated World War One, one a war that started basically because of tangle of alliances in Europe that led to the problem. Or it was a war started by a tangle of alliances in Europe. And then eventually Germany got fitted with all the blame for it, mainly because they were the last country fighting and they had done the most damage, but they weren't the ones who'd started it. It was a country called Austria-Hungary. Now, it might be kind of obvious which countries that was turned into, but or which countries were part of that, but still, it's a lot different than World War Two. Um, I call World War Two a fairy tale narrative. Everyone gets pissed at me for calling it a fairy tale, like the Holocaust was terrible. It's one of the worst things that's ever happened to humanity, if not the worst. However, our involvement in World War Two is a fairy tale. We treat it as such, and that's what pisses me off. Because everyone remembers the war where we were definitely the good guys, not the morally gray war that we decided to step into, and honestly, it was only the fact that we threw soldiers in that did anything because we did not know what we were doing in terms of the military. So, it is interesting though, because very few people know actually the roots of Veterans Day, and I was stupid and thought Veterans Day was yesterday, so I spent the entire day today wishing everyone a happy Armistice Day and then telling them to look up what that was. So they technically knew what it was, but they didn't know what it was for. Um, Although, as a weird little plug, there's been something I've been toying with in the back of my mind for a while now that I've actually started writing a script for. I'm planning on trying to do a series, kind of extra credit style, on the interwar period, or not extra credit style, but just a history channel. But it's not going to be the main thing, and my goal is to try and make gaming videos again, whenever the hell I get around to that. So, but I've been toying around with it, and I've started writing a script for it about the interwar period. Because while there's much better channels covering the Great War, World War One, they do it much better than I ever could. very few people talk about the interwar period. Hell, very few of my history classes talk about the interwar period, and when they do, it's usually treated as this kind of peaceful period between World War One and World War Two. And while sure anything's peaceful compared to those wars, it was not peaceful, say, compared to nowadays. Um, Eastern Europe basically was at war for 5 more years after World War One ended. So it's which is interesting how little people know about it. Not to mention, the rise of Mussolini was actually fairly early in the interwar period. Hitler came around in 1933, and then 6 years later he started the Second World War. But Mussolini had been around since I think 1925. So my goal is to try and cover basically everything that happened in the interwar period, which that's going to be interesting because that became a tangle of so many things so quickly because just after the war, the fallout of the Brest-Litov Treaty between Germany and Russia caused at least 5 different wars, if not 7, but like 2 of those wars are barely covered because it's basically the Russians steamrolling into what is basically Belarus and Ukraine today. Um, so it's going to be interesting to try and cover because a lot happens within that period of about 21 years. Or actually, it's about 20 years because November to September? I'm trying to remember when World War II started. Shit, I can't even remember where it ended. Um, okay, I'm starting to get people's complaints with me. I don't remember many of the dates in World War II. I remember quite a bit in World War One, but that's mainly because I've been watching the Great War channel, so that stuff's fresh in my mind. But anyways, I kind of rambled on a bit there, but long story short, it's just interesting to look back at the start of Veterans Day. It was only in the 50s when we finally decided to make this about veterans, which is a noble cause, but it's just interesting to see that how many people don't really know that there is something more tied to that day. It's the day the Great War ended. It was the day the war to end all wars ended because the fighting stopped. Revolutions didn't, but the fighting stopped. It was a day of peace in Europe where they hoped that they would never have to do this again. And then they completely failed to prevent that. And if anything, the stake should also be remembered for the tragedy of it. Because everyone thought the war was over and we wouldn't need to fight this again. But 20 years later, it came back. The treaty they forced the Germans to sign destroyed them. They destroyed so many other empires, and the Allies caused so many problems all in the name of justice and freedom. They didn't use those words. Those are American words to use for ruining places, but it's pretty damn close to what America does half the time. So I can talk about that more later if anyone's interested. But anyways, I'm going to cut this here. But happy Veterans Day, everyone, even though it was yesterday. And sorry I've been off for at least a month and a half now.